Picture this, a woman who lost her sight but gained the ability to see people's true hearts, standing alone at a family gathering where everyone whispers about her tragedy. Then imagine a billionaire who has everything money can buy except the one thing he's desperately searching for, someone who sees him for who he really is, not what he owns. What happens when these two souls collide at a place where neither expected to find love? What happens when the woman everyone forgot about becomes the guide for the man who thought he had all the answers? If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and join our Dear Love Diaries family. Your special place in this community of heartfelt stories is waiting for you. These passionate journeys of souls connecting against all odds have brought together thousands of beautiful hearts just like yours. Make sure you hit the bell too, so you'll know immediately when a new story unfolds in our diary of love. The morning sun streamed through Janet Smith's apartment window as she sat at her kitchen table, her fingers tracing the raised dots of a braille letter she'd received from her niece Hazel. But it wasn't the letter that held her attention, it was the phone call she knew was coming. Right on schedule, her phone rang with Helen's familiar ringtone. "Don't even think about making excuses," Helen's voice came through the speaker before Janet could say hello. "The entire Smith family reunion is today, and you're going." Janet smiled despite herself. After 3 years of Helen's gentle but persistent efforts to draw her back into family gatherings, her older sister had perfected the art of the preemptive strike. "Good morning to you too, Helen," Janet replied, setting down the letter. "And I wasn't going to make excuses." "No? What about your mysterious art project that suddenly needs urgent attention? Or your volunteer shift at the animal shelter that somehow always coincides with family events?" Janet had to admire Helen's detective skills. Those had indeed been her planned excuses. "Maybe I'm actually looking forward to it this time," Janet said, though they both knew that was only partially true. The truth was more complicated. Janet had been dreading the reunion for weeks, knowing it would mean hours of well-meaning relatives speaking too loudly, offering help she didn't need, and treating her like a fragile inspiration rather than just Janet. But Hazel had been so excited about seeing her, and Janet had realized she was tired of letting her blindness be an excuse for avoiding life. "Helen," Janet said quietly, "promise me something. Anything. Don't hover. I know you mean well, but when you intercept every conversation and answer questions for me, it makes me feel invisible." There was a pause, and Janet could practically hear Helen processing this request. "You're right. I'm sorry. I hate watching people treat you differently. I know. But I need to fight my own battles. Even the uncomfortable ones. Okay. But I reserve the right to accidentally spill punch on anyone who's particularly awful." Janet laughed. "Deal." 2 hours later, Helen's car pulled into the parking lot of the Milbrook Community Center, and Janet felt her familiar pre-gathering anxiety settle in her stomach. She could hear the sounds of the reunion already in full swing, children's laughter, the clatter of folding tables being arranged, the cheerful chaos of a large family coming together. "Ready for this?" Helen asked as she turned off the engine. Janet adjusted her grip on her white cane and took a deep breath. "Ready." But as they approached the community center, Janet couldn't shake the feeling that today would be different somehow. She couldn't have known that 50 miles away, a tech billionaire named Oliver Burns was staring at a highway exit sign for Milbrook, making an impulsive decision that would change both their lives forever. Oliver Burns had been driving for 6 hours straight, fleeing a board meeting that had gone spectacularly wrong. The Patterson merger. The deal that was supposed to cement Burns Technologies' position as the dominant player in enterprise software, had just collapsed. 18 months of negotiations, millions in due diligence costs, and the expectations of every investor and employee in his company, all reduced to polite regrets and firm handshakes. He should have been on a plane back to Silicon Valley, should have been in damage control mode, should have been doing any number of CEO things that responsible billionaires did when their carefully laid plans exploded in their faces. Instead, He was taking random highway exits and driving through small towns that reminded him of a life he'd left behind decades ago. When he saw the sign for Milbrook, something twisted in his chest. He hadn't been back to his hometown in 15 years, hadn't spoken to anyone from his old life in even longer. But maybe that was exactly what he needed, a reminder of who he'd been before he became Oliver Burns, tech mogul, before every conversation became about valuations and market share and strategic partnerships. The town looked smaller than he remembered, but then again, everything looked smaller when you were used to viewing the world from corporate jets and penthouse offices. Main Street still had the same mix of family businesses and empty storefronts, the same sense of a community that was holding on but not quite thriving. Oliver parked in front of the old diner where he'd washed dishes as a teenager, trying to decide if this nostalgic detour was cathartic or just pathetic, when he overheard two women talking as they walked past his car. "I hope Janet decides to come this year," one was saying. "She's missed the last two reunions. Helen says she's coming. Poor thing, though. It's been 3 years since her accident, and she still isolates herself so much. Such a shame. She was always the artistic one, so talented. Hard to imagine how someone adjusts to losing their sight like that." Oliver found himself listening more intently, though he couldn't say why. Well, the Smith family reunion should cheer her up. They're such a close family. The Smith family reunion. Oliver's memory stirred. The Smiths had lived down the street from his family's rundown rental house. Helen Smith had been a few years older, always kind to the kid whose clothes didn't fit right and whose parents were too busy with their own problems to pack proper lunches. And Janet. Janet had been the younger sister with paint-stained fingers and an unconscious grace that had made even teenage Oliver stop and stare. Before he could talk himself out of it, Oliver was walking toward the community center, drawn by curiosity and something deeper he wasn't ready to examine. The building looked exactly the same, down to the faded blue paint and the hand-painted banner that read, "Welcome Smith Family Reunion." He stood in the parking lot for a moment, suddenly uncertain. This wasn't his family, wasn't his gathering. But the need to see familiar faces, to remember who he'd been before success had isolated him from every authentic human connection, was stronger than his embarrassment at showing up uninvited. Inside the community center, the reunion was in full swing. The space buzzed with conversations in multiple languages, children weaving between adults with the fearless energy that only came from being surrounded by people who loved them unconditionally. The smell of potluck dishes and coffee filled the air, mixing with the sound of laughter and the gentle chaos of family reconnection. Oliver hesitated near the entrance, scanning the crowd for familiar faces. Many of the adults he recognized in that vague way of people who'd been part of his childhood landscape, older now, but carrying themselves with the same warmth he remembered. That's when he saw her. Janet Smith stood near a table laden with casserole dishes, her head tilted slightly as she listened to an elderly woman's animated story. She held a white cane with casual confidence, and there was something about her posture, alert but relaxed, present but not performance-aware, that suggested someone who had learned to navigate the world through trust and intuition rather than sight. She was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with conventional standards and everything to do with the quiet self-possession she radiated. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple style that emphasized the elegant line of her neck, and when she laughed at something the elderly woman said, the sound was like music, genuine and unguarded and completely captivating. Oliver found himself moving closer, drawn by something he couldn't name. "Excuse me," said a voice behind him. "Ollie Burns? Is that really you?" Oliver turned to find Mrs. Henderson, his former fourth-grade teacher, whose silver hair and sharp eyes hadn't changed much in the intervening years. "Mrs. Henderson," Oliver said, genuine warmth flooding his voice. "You look exactly the same. And you look like you've been eating regular meals," she said with the frank affection of someone who remembered when he'd sometimes come to school hungry. "I read about your company in the newspaper. Technology," they said. "Doing very well for yourself." "I've been fortunate," Oliver said, the standard response he gave when people brought up his success. Fortunate, nothing. I remember your science fair projects. You were building computers out of spare parts when other kids were making volcanoes out of baking soda. Mrs. Henderson's pride was uncomplicated and genuine, and Oliver felt something tight in his chest begin to loosen. When was the last time someone had looked at him like that? Not because of his net worth or his company's stock price, but because they remembered the curious kid who'd stayed after school to tinker with the ancient computers in the library? Come on, Mrs. Henderson said, taking his arm with the easy authority of someone who'd been managing reluctant students for 4 decades. There are people here who'll be thrilled to see how you turned out. As she guided him deeper into the gathering, Oliver's attention kept drifting back to Janet. She moved through the crowd with remarkable grace, her white cane serving more as identification than navigation tool. He watched her hug relatives, contribute to conversations with easy confidence, and somehow make everyone around her feel heard and valued. It was mesmerizing. That's Janet Smith, Mrs. Henderson said, following his gaze. Helen's younger sister. She's been through a difficult time, but she's one of the strongest people I know. What happened? Oliver asked, though he suspected he already knew from the overheard conversation in the parking lot. Car accident 3 years ago. Lost her sight, but found something else, if you ask me. She teaches art classes at the community center now, works with children. Has a way of helping people see things they never noticed before. Oliver watched Janet interact with a group of teenagers who were clearly hanging on her every word, and he could see what Mrs. Henderson meant. There was something magnetic about Janet's presence, something that made people lean in and listen more carefully. But even as he observed her easy confidence, Oliver noticed something else, the way conversations shifted slightly when people realized they were talking to her, the careful consideration some family members gave their words, as if they were afraid of saying the wrong thing. Janet handled it all with grace, but Oliver could see the subtle way she had to work to maintain her place in conversations that others took for granted. It made him angry in a way that surprised him. This remarkable woman shouldn't have to prove her worth or compensate for other people's discomfort. She should be celebrated, appreciated, seen for the extraordinary person she clearly was. She's incredible, Oliver said quietly. Yes, she is. But I think she gets tired of people telling her that. Sometimes I think what she wants most is to be treated like just another person, not like an inspiration or a tragedy. Mrs. Henderson's words settled into Oliver's mind like a puzzle piece finding its place. He understood something about being seen as a symbol rather than a person, about having every interaction filtered through other people's assumptions and expectations. As if sensing his attention, Janet turned in their direction. Her gaze passed over him without recognition, of course it did, but something about her posture suggested awareness, the kind of heightened attention that came from someone who'd learned to read environments through senses beyond sight. Would you like to meet her? Mrs. Henderson asked. Before Oliver could answer, commotion erupted near the refreshment table. A child had bumped into someone carrying drinks, and a cup of punch was teetering dangerously close to falling directly onto Janet, who was standing nearby and couldn't see it coming. Without conscious thought, Oliver moved. In 3 quick steps, he was beside Janet, his hand shooting out to catch the falling cup before it could drench her dress, his other hand instinctively reaching for her elbow to steady her as she startled at the sudden commotion around her. The moment their skin touched, everything else faded. Oliver felt the slight tremor that ran through Janet's arm, saw the way her lips parted in surprise. She turned toward him, and he found himself looking into eyes that were the deep brown of rich earth, eyes that somehow seemed to be looking directly into him despite her blindness. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was honey over gravel, warm and slightly rough in a way that suggested someone who laughed often and wasn't afraid to speak her mind. Of course, Oliver managed, suddenly aware that he was still holding her elbow, that his thumb was resting against the soft skin of her inner arm, that she hadn't pulled away. "I'm Janet," she said, extending her free hand toward him. "Oliver," he replied, taking her offered hand and finding himself reluctant to let go when the handshake should have ended. Her palm was warm, slightly calloused from what he guessed was artwork, and when her thumb brushed across his knuckles, whether intentionally or accidentally, he couldn't tell, heat shot up his arm like an electric current. "Oliver," she repeated, as if testing the name on her tongue. "You have interesting hands." It was such an unexpected observation that Oliver felt momentarily speechless. "Interesting how?" A smile played at the corners of Janet's mouth. "Strong grip but gentle pressure. Quick reflexes, you caught that cup without hesitation. And..." She paused, her thumb making another deliberate pass over his knuckles, calluses in unexpected places. "You work with your hands, not just paperwork." She was reading him like a book written in Braille, discovering things about him he hadn't even realized were visible. Or in this case, tangible. "What else can you tell?" Oliver asked, fascinated despite himself. "That you're not from around here anymore," Janet said, still holding his hand. "Your clothes are expensive but deliberately understated, like you're trying not to stand out. Your voice has lost its local accent almost entirely, but not quite. And you smell like..." She paused, considering, like expensive hotels and rental cars. Oliver stared at her, amazed. In less than 2 minutes, she'd deduced more about his current life than most people discovered after lengthy conversations. "You're very good at that," he said. "I've had practice. 3 years of learning to read the world differently." The weight in her voice told him there was a story there, probably not a simple one. Oliver found himself wanting to ask, wanting to understand what had brought this obviously remarkable woman to rely on touch and sound and intuition instead of sight. "Janet." A woman's voice interrupted them, and Oliver turned to see Helen Smith approaching with the focused expression of an older sister who'd spotted potential trouble. "Helen," Janet said, and Oliver heard a note of fond exasperation in her voice. "This is Oliver. He just saved me from wearing fruit punch." "How heroic," Helen said, though her assessment of Oliver was clearly ongoing. "I'm Helen, Janet's sister and self-appointed protector." "Oliver Burns," he replied, watching recognition dawn in Helen's eyes. "Burns? As in little Ollie Burns from Maple Street? Theodore Burns' boy?" Oliver felt heat creep up his neck. "That's me." Well. Look how you've grown up." Helen's tone suggested she was reserving judgment about whether that growth had been in positive directions. Before the conversation could become more awkward, a voice over the community center's sound system announced the start of family games. "Oh, perfect timing," Helen said, though something in her tone suggested she found the timing anything but perfect. "Janet, Sophia was looking for you earlier. She wanted to catch up." Oliver recognized a dismissal when he heard one, but Janet's response surprised him. "Sophia can wait," Janet said calmly. "Oliver, would you like to participate in the games?" Fair warning, the Smith family takes their competitions very seriously. It was such a simple invitation, but Oliver felt as if she'd offered him something precious. In a room full of people who knew him as the poor kid who'd made good, Janet was offering him exactly what he needed most, a chance to just be present, to participate, to belong. "I'd like that very much," he said. As they moved toward the activities area, Janet's hand resting lightly on Oliver's arm, he realized something had shifted. The reunion that had felt like a nostalgic indulgence 5 minutes ago now felt like a possibility. Not because of the memories it might revive or the connections it might re-establish, but because of the woman walking beside him, whose presence somehow made him feel more like himself than he had in years. "First up is the 3-legged race," announced the volunteer coordinator. "We need partners, so grab someone and let's see who can make it to the finish line without falling down." Oliver looked around at the other participants, couples who'd clearly done this before, families with practiced coordination, teenagers who were treating it like a joke. Then he looked at Janet, who was listening to the announcement with an expression he couldn't quite read. Would you trust a stranger to be your three-legged race partner? Oliver asked quietly. Janet turned toward him, and that disorienting sensation of being truly seen despite her blindness hit him again. Depends, she said with a small smile. Are you any good at taking direction from someone who can't see where we're going? I'm excellent at following instructions from someone smarter than me. Janet's laugh was genuine and delighted. In that case, how can I refuse? As they made their way to the starting line to register as a team, Oliver realized that for the first time in years, he was doing something purely because it felt right, not because it served some strategic purpose or business objective. He was choosing joy over obligation, connection over achievement. And the woman beside him, who everyone else seemed to think needed protection or inspiration or careful handling, was about to teach him that sometimes the best guides are the ones who've learned to navigate by trust instead of sight. What Oliver didn't know yet was that by the end of this day, Janet Smith wouldn't just be his three-legged race partner. She'd be the person who showed him what he'd been searching for his entire successful, lonely life. The question was whether he'd be brave enough to follow where she led. Chapter 2. At the three-legged race registration table, Oliver watched Janet interact with her teenage niece Hazel, who was clearly in charge of organizing the family games with the serious efficiency that only 16-year-olds could bring to such tasks. Aunt Janet. You're actually participating this year? Hazel's excitement was infectious, and Oliver could see where Janet got her warm smile. Don't sound so shocked, Janet replied with mock indignation. I'll have you know I was quite athletic in my day. I didn't mean, Hazel started, then caught herself. I just meant it's great to see you having fun. Oliver appreciated the teenager's quick recovery. It spoke to a family that had learned to navigate Janet's blindness with love rather than pity. Hazel, this is Oliver, Janet said. Oliver, my niece Hazel, who runs these games like a military operation. Nice to meet you, Hazel said, looking Oliver up and down with the frank assessment that only teenagers could manage. Are you sure you want to partner with Aunt Janet? She's very competitive. I'm counting on it, Oliver replied, charmed by the family dynamic. As they received their team number and moved toward the starting line, Oliver found himself studying the other competitors. Most were family pairs who clearly had experience with this particular tradition. Couples who moved together with practiced ease, siblings who seemed to share an unspoken understanding of each other's rhythm. Nervous? Janet asked as they found a spot to practice their coordination. Should I be? Probably. The Smith family doesn't mess around when it comes to three-legged races. My cousin Marcus holds the current record, 2 minutes and 37 seconds. Oliver looked down the course, which stretched about 50 yards across the community center's main room, weaving between folding chairs and around a few strategically placed obstacles. Any tips for the amateur? He asked. Janet's expression grew serious. The key is not trying to lead or follow, but moving together. We start with the tied leg, always the tied leg first. I'll count us in, and then we just trust each other. Something about the way she said, trust each other, made Oliver's chest tighten. When was the last time anyone had asked him to trust them? When was the last time he'd been trusted with something that mattered, rather than just expected to perform or deliver or solve problems? They positioned themselves at the starting line, and Oliver knelt to tie the soft blue bandana around their ankles, his left, her right. The simple act of binding their legs together felt unexpectedly intimate, and when he looked up to make sure the tie was secure, he found Janet watching him with an expression that was both curious and trusting. How does that feel? He asked, standing and testing their connection. Like we're about to make complete fools of ourselves, Janet said with a grin. But in the best possible way. Ready, racers, called the coordinator from the starting line. Oliver looked around at the other teams, then down at Janet. She was adjusting her grip on his arm, her body language relaxed but focused. There was something about her confidence that made him believe they could actually do this. Ready? She asked quietly. Ready, he replied, meaning it completely. Go. They started moving, and for the first few steps, Oliver was amazed by how well Janet's system worked. She counted quietly, tide, free, tide, free. And he followed, their bodies finding a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. Around them, other couples laughed and stumbled and called out encouragement to each other, but Oliver found himself completely focused on the woman beside him, on matching her pace, on being the partner she needed. "You're a natural at this," Janet said, slightly breathless but clearly enjoying herself. "I have an excellent coach." They were making good progress, staying with the front pack of competitors, when Oliver spotted the first obstacle, a row of folding chairs they needed to weave between. "Chairs coming up," he said quietly. "About 6 steps ahead." "How many?" "4 chairs, with gaps between them. We'll need to take it slow." Janet nodded, adjusting their pace. "Shorter steps through the obstacles. Trust the rhythm, not your eyes." It was such an unexpected piece of advice that Oliver almost stumbled. Trust the rhythm, not your eyes. He'd spent his entire adult life relying on what he could see, measure, analyze. But here was Janet, teaching him to trust something deeper. They navigated the chairs successfully, their coordination improving with each step. But as they approached the final stretch, disaster struck. A child's toy had rolled into their path, a small ball that Oliver saw but couldn't avoid without breaking their rhythm entirely. "Ball," Oliver said quickly, trying to adjust their trajectory. Janet felt the sudden change in his movement and tried to compensate, but the combination of unexpected obstacle and split-second decision-making was too much. Their carefully established rhythm faltered, and suddenly they were going down. Oliver remembered Janet's advice about trusting each other, and instead of fighting the fall, he let them tumble together onto the soft mats that had been strategically placed around the course. They landed in a tangle of limbs and laughter, rolling slightly before coming to rest with Janet half-sprawled across his chest. For a moment, they just lay there, breathing hard and laughing even harder. Other racers stepped carefully around them, some calling out to ask if they were okay, but Oliver barely registered the voices. All of his attention was focused on the woman in his arms, on the way her body felt against his, on the sound of her laughter mixing with his own. This was the first passion peak their story had been building toward, the moment of physical closeness and emotional awareness that would change everything between them. "So much for the Smith family record," Janet gasped, making no immediate move to extract herself from their position. "Are you kidding?" "That was the most fun I've had in years," Oliver said, and realized he meant it completely. The words came out more honestly than he'd intended, loaded with a loneliness he rarely acknowledged. Janet must have heard something in his voice because her laughter faded, and she shifted slightly to look at his face. "Years?" she asked softly. "Yeah. Years." They were close enough that Oliver could see the gold flecks in her brown eyes, close enough that her breath was warm against his cheek. Her hand was pressed against his chest, and he wondered if she could feel how hard his heart was beating. "That's a long time to go without fun," Janet said, her voice gentle with understanding. "Too long," Oliver agreed. The moment stretched between them, intimate despite being in full view of Janet's entire extended family. Oliver became hyper-aware of everywhere their bodies touched, her hand against his chest, her leg still tangled with his, the soft weight of her against him. The sounds of the reunion faded into background noise, leaving only the two of them in their small circle of fallen bandanas and unexpected connection. "We should probably get up," Janet said quietly, though she made no move to do so. "Probably," Oliver agreed, equally motionless. "People are watching. Let them watch." The intensity in his voice surprised them both. Janet's eyes widened slightly, and Oliver felt her hand press more firmly against his chest. "Oliver," she said, his name barely more than a whisper. "Yeah. Thank you. For asking me to be your partner. For not treating me like I might break." The simple gratitude in her voice broke something open in Oliver's chest. When was the last time someone had thanked him for something that had nothing to do with money or business connections? When was the last time he'd done something purely because it felt right? "Thank you for trusting me," he replied. "Even when I led us straight into a toy ball." Janet laughed, finally beginning to extract herself from their tangle. "Especially then." Oliver helped her to her feet, steadying her as they brushed grass stains from their clothes and untied the bandana from their ankles. But even after they were free, Janet's hand remained in his, her fingers intertwined with his in a way that felt both natural and electric. "Well, that was humiliating," said a familiar voice behind them. They turned to find Helen approaching, but her expression was amused rather than concerned. "I'm sorry," Oliver began, but Helen waved him off. "Don't apologize. I haven't seen Janet laugh like that since before her accident. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." Janet's cheeks flushed pink. "Helen, I'm just saying. It's nice to see you having fun instead of sitting on the sidelines being gracious about being excluded." The words hit Oliver with unexpected force. Janet had been excluded from activities because people were afraid or uncomfortable or simply didn't think to ask. The thought of this remarkable woman being sidelined because of other people's assumptions made something fierce and protective rise in his chest. "What's next?" he asked quickly, wanting to redirect the conversation away from Janet's discomfort. "Scavenger hunt," Helen announced. "Same teams, and I have to warn you, the competition gets serious. Last year, my cousin spent 40 minutes looking for something that represents wisdom and came back with Mrs. Patterson's reading glasses." "I love scavenger hunts," Janet said, her enthusiasm genuine. "Fair warning, Oliver, I'm very competitive when it comes to finding things. Good thing I'm excellent at following directions from someone smarter than me. Have you ever had someone choose you as their partner when everyone else overlooked you? Those moments when someone sees your value and trusts you completely can change everything. Share your stories in the comments below. We love hearing about times when partnership and trust created something beautiful." As they collected their scavenger hunt list from the activities table, Oliver realized that something fundamental had shifted during their fall. The careful politeness of new acquaintances had given way to something more comfortable, more intimate. They moved together now with an easy familiarity, Janet's hand on his arm feeling natural rather than tentative. The scavenger hunt list was a mix of the obvious and the cryptic: something red, something that makes music, something older than the town, something that represents hope, something that shows the passage of time. "This is going to require strategy," Oliver said, studying the list. "And local knowledge," Janet added. "Lucky for you, I know where all the good hiding spots are." "Lucky for me," Oliver agreed, but he wasn't thinking about the scavenger hunt. They set off together, and what Oliver discovered over the next hour was that Janet's blindness, rather than being a hindrance, actually gave them distinct advantages. While other teams spent time looking around randomly, Janet knew exactly where to direct their search. "Something that makes music," Oliver read from the list. "Easy," Janet said. "Can you see the playground area from here?" Oliver looked around, spotting the small playground to their left. "Yes, over by the swing set." "Perfect." Mrs. Patterson hung wind chimes there last spring. She made them herself from old keys and spoons. "Can you guide me over there?" Oliver offered his arm, and they walked together toward the playground. As they got closer, the soft tinkling of metal on metal became audible. "There," Janet said with satisfaction as the sound reached them. "I'd recognize that particular combination of notes anywhere." She was right. Oliver would have spent 20 minutes searching, but Janet had navigated them directly to their target through sound and memory. "Something red," Oliver read next. Janet paused, head tilted in thought. "That's trickier since I can't see colors. But I know where the community center keeps their emergency equipment. There should be a red fire extinguisher mounted on the wall near the kitchen entrance." Can you spot it? Oliver scanned the area and found the bright red extinguisher exactly where Janet had predicted. Found it. How did you know that? I helped with the safety inspection last year. When you can't rely on visual cues, you remember details differently. Oliver found himself fascinated not just by Janet's knowledge, but by the way she navigated the world. Every solution came from a deep understanding of her environment that went far beyond what sight alone could provide. Something older than the town, Oliver read as they continued their hunt. Okay, this one's my favorite, Janet said with obvious excitement. There's a cornerstone on the east side of the building, the side facing the parking lot. It should have a date carved into it. Can you walk me over there and look for it? They made their way to the foundation, Oliver describing what he saw as they went. I see several stones that look different from the others, he said, examining the building's base. Check for dates, Janet suggested. There should be one that predates the town's incorporation. Here, Oliver said, stopping in front of a weathered cornerstone. This one says 1892. Perfect. Janet smiled. Milbrook was incorporated in 1894. This building predates the official town by 2 years. I discovered that when I was researching local history for a community project. Something that represents hope, Oliver read as they approached their final items. Janet was quiet for a longer moment, and Oliver could sense her really considering this one. I know what it is, she said finally. But it's personal. Are you okay with that? Of course. There's a memorial garden behind the community center. I need you to guide me there. It should be past the main building, toward the back where it's quieter. Oliver looked around, spotting a pathway that led around the building. I think I see it. Here, take my arm. They walked together around the community center, following a small stone path that led to a peaceful garden area. Oliver could see a bench beneath an old oak tree ahead of them. Do you see a stone bench under the big oak? Janet asked. Yes, right ahead of us. That's it, Janet said, her voice soft with emotion as Oliver guided her to the bench. She reached out to touch the back of it, her fingers finding the carved inscription. In memory of those who taught us that love is the only thing that grows when shared. This, Janet said, running her fingers over the inscription with obvious reverence. This represents hope. Oliver stared at the simple profundity of the message, feeling something shift in his chest. It's beautiful, he said softly. I designed this garden, Janet said quietly. After my accident, when I was trying to figure out how to live in the world differently, the community center asked if I wanted to create something meaningful here. This bench, this inscription, it was my way of processing what I'd learned about what really matters. Oliver felt the weight of that revelation settle over him. This wasn't just a clever answer to a scavenger hunt clue. This was Janet sharing a piece of her soul, showing him how she transformed pain into something beautiful and meaningful. Thank you, he said quietly. For what? For sharing this with me. For letting me see how you see things. Janet smiled. That's what partners do, isn't it? They show each other new ways of understanding the world. Something that shows the passage of time, Oliver read, consulting their list for the final item. Janet was quiet for a moment, then turned toward him with an expression he couldn't quite read. You, she said simply. Me? Think about it. You left here as one person, a boy with dreams and struggles and uncertainty about the future. And you came back as someone completely different. You're walking proof that time changes everything, that people can become more than their circumstances suggested was possible. Oliver felt something twist in his chest. How do you know I'm different? Because people keep talking about how you've done so well for yourself, how you're not the same boy who used to live on Maple Street. But also because. She paused, her fingers finding his hand, because I can hear it in your voice. Success, yes, but also a kind of loneliness that comes from leaving everything familiar behind. Once again, Janet had read him with an accuracy that took his breath away. She saw, truly saw, not just his transformation, but the cost of it. "Is that a good answer for the scavenger hunt?" she asked with a small smile. "It's perfect," Oliver said, and realized he was talking about more than just their final clue. As they headed back toward the community center with their completed list, Oliver realized that somewhere between the three-legged race and the memorial garden, between Janet's laughter and her quiet wisdom, something profound had happened. He'd found someone who saw him, really saw him. Not for what he'd accomplished or acquired, but for who he was underneath all of it. And for the first time in years, that person felt like someone worth knowing. But as they approached the submission table, Oliver's phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it, focused on Janet and their shared victory, but it buzzed again. And again. The outside world, his world, was calling, reminding him that he had responsibilities and obligations that stretched far beyond small-town scavenger hunts and afternoon conversations with remarkable women. The question was whether what he'd found here was strong enough to survive the collision with his real life. The question was whether he was brave enough to find out. Chapter 3. As they approached the scavenger hunt submission table, Oliver's phone continued its insistent buzzing. He tried to ignore it, focusing on the warmth of Janet's hand on his arm and the satisfied smile on her face as they prepared to turn in their completed list. "Janet and Oliver, back with perfect timing," Hazel announced as they handed over their answers. "Let me just check these over. Wow, Aunt Janet, this is really impressive. Especially the last one. Something that shows the passage of time. Most people bring back old photographs or vintage items. We had a creative breakthrough," Janet said, squeezing Oliver's arm gently. As Hazel tallied scores and other teams submitted their findings, Oliver felt his phone buzz again. This time, the vibration was longer, more urgent, someone calling rather than texting. "You should answer that," Janet said quietly, her heightened hearing having caught the sound. "It seems important." "It's probably work," Oliver said, reluctant to break the spell of their perfect afternoon. "It can wait." "Can it, though?" Janet's voice was gentle but perceptive. "You've been tense every time it buzzes. And whoever it is clearly isn't giving up." Oliver looked down at his phone screen. James Whitfield. 3 missed calls and 5 unread messages. His business partner wouldn't be this persistent unless something significant was happening. "I'm sorry," Oliver said, genuinely apologetic. "Let me just see what this is about." He stepped a few feet away and quickly scanned the messages. The Patterson merger, which had exploded spectacularly that morning, was creating ripple effects throughout the industry. Stock prices were fluctuating, board members were demanding explanations, and there were rumors of a hostile takeover attempt by their biggest competitor. "Burns, thank God," James's voice was tight with stress when Oliver called him back. "We have a situation. Chen Industries is making moves on our smaller clients, using the Patterson fallout as leverage. The board wants an emergency meeting tomorrow morning." Oliver closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his responsibilities crashing back down on him. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough that if we don't get ahead of this, we could lose 20% of our client base within the month. I know you're, wherever you are, but we need you back. Tonight, if possible." Oliver looked back toward Janet, who was listening to Hazel announce the scavenger hunt winners with obvious enjoyment. She looked so at ease, so naturally part of this warm family gathering, and he felt like an imposter for even being here. "Give me 2 hours," Oliver said into the phone. "I'll be on the road back to the airport by then." "Thank you. I know this isn't ideal timing, but it's fine, James. This is what we do." Oliver hung up and walked back to Janet, who seemed to sense his mood shift before he said anything. "Bad news?" she asked quietly. "Work crisis. I need to get back to California tonight." Janet nodded, her expression carefully neutral. Of course. That's what happens with important jobs, right? Emergencies don't wait for convenient timing. There was something in her voice, not accusation, exactly, but a kind of resigned understanding that made Oliver's chest tighten. How many times had Janet's plans been disrupted by other people's priorities? How often had she been the understanding one while everyone else dealt with their important obligations? Attention, everyone. Hazel called out from the front of the room. We have our scavenger hunt winners. With perfect scores and some truly creative interpretations, the champions are Team Janet and Oliver. The announcement was met with applause and good-natured groaning from the losing teams. Janet's face lit up with genuine pleasure, and Oliver felt a stab of regret so sharp it was almost physical. This should have been a moment of shared celebration, but instead, all he could think about was the conference call he'd be joining in 3 hours and the crisis management that would consume his next few days. We did it, Janet said, turning toward him with that radiant smile. We actually won. We make a good team, Oliver replied, and realized he was talking about much more than scavenger hunts. They made their way to the prize table, where the traditional winner's reward was first choice of the dessert selection. The spread was impressive: homemade pies, elaborate cakes, and cookies that looked like they belonged in a bakery window. The chocolate cake, Janet said without hesitation. Helen made it, and it's legendary in our family. Plus, there's definitely enough for 2 people to share. Are you asking me to share your victory spoils? Oliver asked, trying to match her playful tone despite the weight of his impending departure. I'm asking if you'd like to sit somewhere quiet and have dessert with me before you disappear back to your real life. The words were light, but Oliver heard the deeper meaning underneath. Before you disappear back to your real life. Janet had already categorized this afternoon as separate from reality, already accepted that whatever was happening between them existed outside the boundaries of their actual lives. They found a quiet table in a corner of the community center, away from the main flow of family conversations. The chocolate cake was as legendary as advertised, rich and perfectly textured, but Oliver found himself more focused on watching Janet enjoy it than on tasting it himself. So, Janet said after a few bites, tell me about this real life you have to get back to. The one that generates emergency phone calls on Saturday afternoons. It was the moment Oliver had been both expecting and dreading. How did he explain his world, the board meetings and private jets and decisions that affected thousands of people, to someone whose life seemed so grounded, so connected to real relationships and meaningful experiences? It's complicated, he said finally. Most interesting things are. Oliver took a breath, choosing his words carefully. I run a technology company. We develop software that helps other businesses operate more efficiently. It's been successful beyond what I originally imagined. Successful enough that you take spontaneous trips to small towns for nostalgia purposes? Something like that. Janet was quiet for a moment, and Oliver could practically hear her thinking, processing not just his words but everything she'd observed about him throughout the day. You're being deliberately vague, she said finally. Maybe. Why? Because I don't want this to change. I don't want you to look at me differently. Oliver, Janet said gently, I'm blind. I don't look at you at all. I listen to you, I feel how you move through the world, I pay attention to how you treat people and what makes you laugh. Your bank account doesn't change any of that. It was such a simple statement, but it hit Oliver with the force of revelation. When was the last time someone had said something like that to him? When was the last time he'd been with someone who genuinely didn't care about his wealth? It's more than a bank account, he said quietly. The company, it's become very large. Very visible. It changes how people interact with me. How so? They want things. Investments, partnerships, donations, introductions. Or they're intimidated, like they can't just be themselves around me. Or they assume I'm arrogant or out of touch or that I don't understand what real problems look like. Janet listened without interrupting, her fork paused halfway to her mouth as she gave him her complete attention. Are you? She asked when he finished. Out of touch? I try not to be. But sometimes I wonder if success changes you whether you want it to or not. Today, with you, I feel like myself again. Like the person I was before I learned to be careful about everything I say and do. Janet smiled. Good. Because I like the person you are when you're not being careful. The simplicity of her acceptance took Oliver's breath away. No probing questions about his net worth, no subtle hints about opportunities or favors, no careful recalculation of his value based on new information. Just genuine warmth and continued interest in him as a person. His phone buzzed again, a text from his assistant about flight arrangements. Janet heard it and tilted her head slightly. You really do need to go, don't you? Yeah. I really do. Before you leave, Janet said, her voice taking on a slightly more serious tone, can I ask you something? Anything. This afternoon, the games, the conversation, the way you've treated me, was any of it real? Or was I just an interesting diversion from your business crisis? The question hit Oliver like a physical blow. Janet, of course it was real. How could you think, because men like you don't usually notice women like me. And when they do, it's often because we're a novelty, or because helping us makes them feel good about themselves. Men like me? Successful. Important. Used to having choices about how you spend your time and who you spend it with. Oliver felt something fierce and protective rise in his chest. Janet, look at me. Really look. She turned toward him, her brown eyes focusing in his general direction with that disconcerting intensity he was beginning to recognize. You are not a novelty. You are not a charity case. You are not some good deed I'm doing to feel better about myself. You are the most remarkable person I've met in years, and spending this afternoon with you has reminded me what it feels like to be genuinely happy. The honesty in his voice made Janet's breath catch. Oliver, I know we just met. I know this is probably crazy. But I can't remember the last time I felt this, present. This much like the person I want to be. It's not crazy, Janet said quietly. I feel it too. The confession hung between them, loaded with possibility and uncertainty. Oliver found himself leaning forward, drawn by the honesty in Janet's voice, the vulnerability she was offering him. What happens now? He asked. I don't know. Your life is in California, and mine is here. You have companies to run and crises to manage, and I have art classes to teach and a very ordinary life to live. The practical reality of their situation settled over them like a cloud. Oliver's life was board meetings and international flights and decisions worth millions of dollars. Janet's was rooted in community and family and the kind of meaningful connections that couldn't be maintained from a distance. Distance doesn't have to be impossible, Oliver said, though even as he said it, he wasn't sure he believed it. Doesn't it? Janet's voice was gentle but realistic. Oliver, be honest with me. When you go back to your world, when you're dealing with whatever crisis pulled you away from here, are you really going to have time for phone calls with the small-town art teacher? Are you going to remember how this felt when you're back in boardrooms and conference calls? The questions were reasonable and devastating in equal measure. Oliver wanted to protest, to insist that what they'd found together was too important to let slip away. But he could already feel his mind shifting into crisis management mode, already sensed the pull of obligations and responsibilities that had defined his life for so long he'd forgotten there were alternatives. I want to, he said finally. Wanting to and being able to are different things. Before Oliver could respond, his phone rang again. This time it was his driver, confirming pickup time for his ride to the airport. I have to take this, Oliver said apologetically. Janet nodded, her expression carefully neutral as Oliver coordinated his departure logistics. When he hung up, she was sitting quietly, her hands folded in her lap. 45 minutes, Oliver said. My ride will be here in 45 minutes. Then we should make the most of them. They finished their cake in comfortable silence, both aware that they were borrowing time that didn't really belong to them. Oliver found himself memorizing details. The way Janet tilted her head when she was thinking, the sound of her laugh, the graceful movement of her hands as she spoke. Oliver, Janet said as they prepared to rejoin the reunion activities, promise me something? Anything. Don't make promises about staying in touch unless you mean them. I'd rather have this one perfect afternoon than weeks of gradually fading phone calls and increasingly distant text messages. The request was so pragmatic and so heartbreaking that Oliver felt something crack in his chest. She was already protecting herself from the disappointment she expected, already accepting that he would disappoint her. What if I do mean them? He asked quietly. Then prove it. But don't make me hope for something that isn't real. Before Oliver could respond, Helen appeared beside their table with the careful timing of someone who'd been watching from a distance. Janet, honey, she said, some of the cousins want to take a group photo before people start heading home. And Oliver. She paused, clearly having noticed his phone activity. I'm guessing you need to get going soon? Unfortunately, yes. Work emergency. Helen nodded with the understanding of someone who'd spent her career in healthcare, where emergencies didn't respect personal plans. Well, it was lovely to see you again. Don't be such a stranger. As Janet stood to join her family for photos, Oliver felt the weight of their impending goodbye settling over him. In less than an hour, he'd be in a car heading back to his jet, back to his crisis, back to the life that had felt so important this morning and now seemed almost hollow by comparison. I'll walk you out when your ride comes, Janet said quietly. You don't have to, I want to. The next 30 minutes passed in a blur of family goodbyes and final conversations. Oliver found himself shaking hands with relatives who expressed genuine pleasure at seeing him again, accepting invitations to not be such a stranger, and feeling the warmth of a community that had somehow managed to remember him fondly despite his long absence. But through it all, his attention remained focused on Janet, on the way she moved through her family with such grace and confidence, on the knowledge that in a few minutes, he'd be walking away from the most meaningful connection he'd made in years. When his phone buzzed with a text that his ride had arrived, Oliver felt something like panic rise in his chest. This was it. This was where the fantasy ended and reality reasserted itself. My car's here, he said quietly to Janet, who was standing beside him as they watched Hazel organize the final group photo. Then let's go, she said simply. They walked outside together, the early evening air still warm but carrying the promise of cooler temperatures ahead. Oliver's black sedan was waiting in the parking lot, its windows tinted and engine running, a reminder of the world he was returning to. So this is it, Janet said as they stopped beside the car. This doesn't have to be it. Doesn't it? Janet stepped closer, close enough that Oliver could catch the scent of her perfume, could see the way the late afternoon light caught the gold in her brown eyes. You're going back to California to save your company. I'm going back to my apartment to grade art projects and plan next week's classes. These are our real lives, Oliver. This afternoon was beautiful, but it was also make-believe. It didn't feel like make-believe. No, Janet agreed softly. It didn't. She reached up, her hand finding his face with the careful precision of someone who navigated the world through touch. Her fingers traced his jawline softly, reading his expression through her fingertips. Thank you, she said quietly. For giving me the best day I've had in 3 years. For treating me like a partner instead of a project. For reminding me what it feels like to be seen. Thank you, Oliver replied, for showing me who I used to be. For reminding me what matters. Janet's hand lingered on his cheek for a moment longer, then slowly withdrew. Goodbye, Oliver Burns. This isn't goodbye, Oliver said desperately. I'll call you. I'll figure out a way to make this work. Janet smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. Maybe you will. I hope you do. But right now, you have people depending on you, and I have a life to get back to. She turned and began walking back toward the community center, her white cane tapping softly against the pavement. Oliver stood beside his car, watching her go, fighting the urge to call out, to run after her, to abandon his responsibilities for the first time in his adult life. But his phone was buzzing again, and the driver was waiting, and somewhere in California, a crisis was spinning out of control without him. As Oliver got into the car and watched the community center disappear in the rearview mirror, he realized that Janet had been right about one thing: wanting to bridge the gap between their worlds and being able to do it were very different things indeed. The question was whether what they'd found together was worth the fight it would take to prove her wrong. The question was whether he was brave enough to try. Chapter 4. 3 weeks later, Oliver stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Silicon Valley office, looking out at a view that had once impressed him and now felt like a prison. The crisis that had pulled him away from Milbrook had been resolved, Chen Industries' takeover attempt thwarted, client relationships stabilized, stock prices recovered. He should have felt victorious. Instead, he felt hollow. "The Patterson replacement deal is ready for your review," James Whitfield said, entering Oliver's office with a stack of contracts. "Morrison Tech is actually a better fit than Patterson ever was. Better technology, cleaner financials, and they're eager to close." Oliver nodded absently, his attention still fixed on the view outside. Somewhere beyond those hills was a highway that led to a small town where a remarkable woman was probably teaching art classes to children, helping them see the world through touch and imagination. "Oliver? Did you hear what I said? Morrison Tech. Better fit. Ready to close." Oliver turned away from the window. "Schedule it for next week." James studied his business partner with obvious concern. "Are you okay? You've been different since you got back from wherever you disappeared to that weekend." "I'm fine. Just tired." But Oliver wasn't fine, and he wasn't just tired. He was haunted. Haunted by the memory of Janet's laugh during the three-legged race. Haunted by the way she'd traced his face with her fingertips in the parking lot. Haunted by her words, "Don't make promises unless you mean them." He'd meant them. God help him, he'd meant every word. But 3 weeks of 18-hour days and back-to-back crises had proven Janet's point about the impossibility of bridging their worlds. He'd managed exactly 2 phone calls to her, brief, awkward conversations interrupted by urgent meetings and conference calls. The second time, he'd heard something change in her voice, a careful distance that told him she was already protecting herself from the disappointment she'd expected. After that, he'd stopped calling. Not because he'd stopped caring, but because he couldn't bear to hear that distance grow wider with each interrupted conversation. "Oliver," James said carefully, "I know the Patterson thing was a blow, but this Morrison deal more than makes up for it. You should be celebrating." "Should I? What's that supposed to mean?" Oliver looked around his office, at the awards on the walls, the expensive furniture, the photographs of him with politicians and celebrities and other titans of industry. It was everything he'd worked for, everything he'd dreamed of when he was a poor kid in Milbrook with more ambition than opportunities. So why did it all feel meaningless? "James, can I ask you something?" "Sure. When was the last time you did something just because it made you happy? Not because it was strategic or profitable or good for the company, but just because it brought you joy?" James looked at him as if he'd asked when was the last time he'd sprouted wings and flown to the moon. What kind of question is that? We're running a business, Oliver. Joy is what happens when the quarterly numbers come in ahead of projections. Is it, though? Before James could respond, Oliver's assistant knocked on the door. "Mr. Burns? Your father is here to see you." Oliver's mood, already dark, plummeted further. Theodore Burns made unscheduled visits only when he had complaints about how Oliver was running the company that had made them both wealthy beyond their wildest dreams. Send him in. Theodore Burns entered the office with the commanding presence that had intimidated Oliver throughout his childhood and still made him feel 12 years old. Expensive suit, perfect posture, and the expression of a man who'd built his identity around being disappointed in his son's choices. Oliver. You look tired. Hello, Dad. What brings you by? Concern. I've been hearing things. What kind of things? That you've been distracted. That you missed the Patterson merger because you were off somewhere having a personal crisis. That you're making questionable decisions about company priorities. Oliver felt anger rise in his chest, not at his father's criticism, but at the realization that even his brief moment of happiness in Milbrook had somehow become fodder for corporate gossip. The Patterson merger collapsed because of regulatory issues, not because of anything I did or didn't do. And the Morrison deal is actually better for us. That's not what I'm talking about, and you know it. Theodore's voice carried the edge it had always held when Oliver disappointed him. You disappeared for an entire weekend. No one could reach you. James said you were acting like a completely different person when you got back. Maybe that's not a bad thing. Excuse me? Maybe being a different person isn't the worst thing that could happen to me. Theodore's expression hardened. Oliver, I understand that running a company this size comes with pressure. But you can't afford to have personal crises that affect your judgment. Too many people depend on you. Right. Too many people depend on me. So I'm supposed to sacrifice everything else, my happiness, my personal relationships, any chance at a real life, to keep the stock price stable. You're supposed to honor your responsibilities. That's what adults do. The criticism hit Oliver exactly where his father intended it to. But instead of feeling ashamed, Oliver felt something else. A kind of clarity that had been building for 3 weeks. You know what, Dad? You're right. I do have responsibilities. But maybe some of them are more important than quarterly earnings. Theodore's eyes narrowed. What's that supposed to mean? It means I need to go to Milbrook. Milbrook? What the hell is in Milbrook? Someone who matters to me. Oliver, you can't be serious. You're going to abandon the Morrison negotiations to chase after some small town, don't. Oliver's voice carried a warning that made Theodore stop mid-sentence. Don't finish that sentence. For a moment, father and son stared at each other across the expensive office, years of disappointment and expectation hanging between them. The Morrison deal can wait until Monday, Oliver said finally. James can handle the preliminary negotiations. I'll be back for the closing. And if this personal crisis of yours interferes with your ability to run this company? Oliver looked at his father, really looked at him, and saw a man who'd spent so many years building walls around his heart that he'd forgotten what it felt like to care about anything beyond profit margins and market share. Then maybe I need to reconsider what's really important. Theodore's expression shifted from disappointment to something approaching alarm. Oliver, think about what you're saying. You've worked your entire adult life to build this company. You can't throw it all away for some romantic fantasy. I'm not throwing anything away. I'm trying to build something that actually matters. Without waiting for his father's response, Oliver walked to his desk and began shutting down his computer. James, he called to his business partner, who was hovering uncertainly in the doorway. Clear my schedule until Monday. And book me on the next flight to Chicago. Oliver, James said carefully, are you sure about this? The Morrison people are expecting, the Morrison people can wait 48 hours. If they can't, then they're not the kind of partners we want anyway. As Oliver packed his briefcase, his phone buzzed with a text from his assistant confirming his flight. In 3 hours, he'd be in the air. In 6 hours, he'd be driving through the countryside toward Milbrook, toward a conversation he should have had 3 weeks ago. He just hoped he wasn't too late. Meanwhile, in Milbrook, Janet sat in her apartment, grading art projects from her Tuesday classes. The children had been working on texture collages, projects designed to help them explore the world through touch rather than sight. One student, 8-year-old Marcus, had created a piece that was so thoughtful and sophisticated that Janet found herself smiling despite her melancholy mood. Her phone rang, displaying Sophia's name on the screen. Janet's best friend had been calling every few days since the reunion, checking in with the gentle persistence of someone who knew Janet was struggling but wasn't sure how to help. "Hey, Sophia. Hey yourself. How are you feeling today?" It was Sophia's standard question, asked with the careful tone of someone who'd watched her friend's brief burst of happiness after the reunion gradually fade back into the quiet sadness that had become Janet's default setting. "I'm okay. Grading projects, planning tomorrow's lessons. The usual." "Have you heard from him?" Janet didn't need to ask who him was. Oliver's brief reappearance in her life had become the elephant in every conversation, the subject that everyone wanted to discuss but no one quite knew how to approach. "No. And I don't expect to. Janet, Sophia, we talked about this. He went back to his life, I stayed in mine. That's how these things work." "But you cared about him." "Of course I cared about him. That's exactly why I'm not going to spend months waiting for phone calls that won't come and promises that can't be kept." Sophia was quiet for a moment. "You know, it's okay to hope for things, even when they seem impossible." "Is it? Because hoping for impossible things just makes the disappointment worse when reality sets in. What if it's not impossible, though? What if he's trying to figure out how to make it work?" Janet set down the art project she'd been reviewing and leaned back in her chair. "Sophia, he's a billionaire who runs a technology company. I'm a part-time art teacher who lives in a one-bedroom apartment and takes the bus to work. We had one beautiful afternoon together, but that doesn't change the fundamental reality of who we are and what our lives look like. Sometimes reality can be changed. And sometimes it can't. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is accept that some connections, no matter how meaningful, aren't meant to last beyond the moment they happen." After Sophia hung up, Janet sat in her quiet apartment, surrounded by children's art projects and the gentle hum of her everyday life. She thought about Oliver's face when he'd talked about feeling like himself again, about the way he'd laughed during the three-legged race, about the careful honesty in his voice when he'd said he didn't want her to look at him differently. She thought about the way his hand had felt when she'd read his character through touch, about the electric current that had run between them from their very first contact, about the rare and precious feeling of being truly seen by someone who didn't need to fix or save or inspire her. Most of all, she thought about the promise she'd made to herself 3 years ago, when she was learning to navigate the world without sight. To protect her heart fiercely, to build a life that was full and meaningful on its own terms, and never to make her happiness dependent on someone else's presence. It had been the right promise then. It was still the right promise now. Even if it felt like it was breaking her heart. Oliver's rental car pulled into Milbrook just as the sun was setting, painting the small town in the same golden light that had made everything seem magical 3 weeks ago. But now, driving through streets that had once felt familiar and welcoming, Oliver felt only anxiety and uncertainty. What was he doing here? What did he expect to accomplish? Janet had been clear about her feelings regarding long-distance promises and impractical romantic gestures. She'd probably think he was exactly the kind of entitled rich man who assumed he could solve any problem by throwing attention and resources at it. But as Oliver parked outside Janet's apartment building, an address he'd gotten from Mrs. Henderson, who'd been delighted to hear from him and surprisingly willing to help with what she'd called romantic logistics, he realized that his motivation wasn't entitlement. It was desperation. Desperation to prove that what they'd shared had been real. Desperation to show her that some promises were worth keeping, even when they were difficult. Desperation to find out if the connection that had changed everything for him had been as meaningful to her as it had been to him. Oliver sat in his car for 10 minutes, gathering courage and trying to figure out what he was going to say. Finally, he realized that there were no perfect words for what he was trying to do. There was only honesty and hope and the willingness to risk being wrong about everything. He walked up to Janet's apartment and knocked on the door, his heart pounding so hard he was sure she'd be able to hear it through the wood. The door opened, and there she was. Janet stood in the doorway wearing jeans and a soft sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders, and Oliver felt the same jolt of recognition and attraction he'd experienced at the reunion. But now her expression was guarded, careful in a way that made his chest tighten. "Oliver?" Her voice was surprised but not unwelcoming. "What are you doing here?" "Keeping a promise," he said quietly. "If you'll let me." Janet was quiet for a long moment, and Oliver could practically see her weighing options, calculating risks, deciding whether to let him back into the careful equilibrium she'd rebuilt over the past 3 weeks. "You should come in," she said finally, stepping aside to let him pass. Janet's apartment was small but warm, filled with tactile art pieces and furniture arranged with the precise functionality of someone who'd learned to navigate by memory and touch. The space felt intensely personal, and Oliver felt honored to be allowed inside. "Can I offer you something to drink?" Janet asked, moving toward the kitchen with the easy confidence of someone in her own space. "Just water would be great." As Janet prepared their drinks, Oliver looked around her apartment, trying to understand how she'd built this life for herself. Every detail spoke of intentionality and adaptation, books in Braille alongside audiobook players, art supplies organized with systematic precision, furniture positioned to create clear pathways through the space. "You have a beautiful home," Oliver said as Janet handed him a glass of water. "Thank you. It took some time to get it right, but it works for me now." They settled on her couch, sitting close enough to talk comfortably but far enough apart to maintain the careful distance Janet had established. Oliver could feel the tension in the air, not hostile, but wary, as if Janet was protecting herself from disappointment she'd learned to expect. "So," Janet said, her voice carefully neutral, "you kept your promise. You're here. What now?" "Now I try to explain why it took me 3 weeks to figure out what should have been obvious from the moment I left. Which is that walking away from you was the biggest mistake I've ever made." Janet's expression didn't change, but Oliver saw her hands tighten slightly around her water glass. "Oliver, we talked about this. Your life is in California. Mine is here. That hasn't changed just because you drove back to Milbrook. What if it could change?" "What do you mean?" Oliver took a breath, knowing that what he was about to say would either bridge the gap between them or destroy any chance they might have had. "I mean, what if I told you that I've spent the last 3 weeks being miserable? What if I told you that I've closed billion-dollar deals and felt nothing, solved complex problems and felt empty, achieved everything I thought I wanted and realized none of it matters without someone to share it with?" Janet was quiet, listening with the focused attention he remembered from their afternoon together. "What if I told you," Oliver continued, "that you changed everything for me? That you reminded me who I used to be, who I want to be again? That being with you felt more real than anything I've experienced in years?" "I'd say that sounds wonderful," Janet said softly. "But I'd also say that feelings aren't enough to overcome practical realities. What if the practical realities could change?" "How?" This was the moment Oliver had been building toward, the offer he'd spent 6 hours on a plane planning and refining. "What if I moved back to Milbrook?" Janet's water glass stopped halfway to her lips. "What? What if I relocated here? Set up a satellite office, work remotely, build a life that's actually sustainable instead of one that requires me to sacrifice everything else for the company?" "Oliver, you can't be serious. You'd give up your life in California for, what? For me? For us? For the possibility of us?" Janet set down her water glass and turned toward him fully, her expression intense and searching. "Oliver, that's She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts. That's an incredible gesture. But it's also terrifying. Why terrifying? Because what if it doesn't work? What if you move here and discover that what we felt at the reunion was just, I don't know, temporary chemistry? What if you give up your real life and then resent me for it? What if it does work? Oliver countered. What if what we felt was real, and what we could build together is better than anything either of us could achieve alone? Janet was quiet for a long moment, and Oliver could see her wrestling with hope and fear in equal measure. You really want to move back to Milbrook? She asked finally. I want to be wherever you are. If that's Milbrook, then yes, I want to move back to Milbrook. But your company will survive without me being physically present every day. Technology companies should probably embrace remote work, don't you think? Despite everything, Janet smiled at that. It would be ironic if a tech billionaire couldn't figure out how to work from a distance. Is that a yes? It's a, maybe. It's a, let's see what this looks like, and a, let's take it slowly, and a, let's not make any dramatic life changes until we're sure about what we're doing. Oliver felt hope bloom in his chest for the first time in 3 weeks. I can work with maybe. Can you? Because maybe means uncertainty, and I get the impression you're used to having more control over outcomes than that. I'm learning to appreciate uncertainty. Especially when it comes with the possibility of you. Janet reached out, her hand finding his with the same careful precision he remembered from the reunion. When their fingers intertwined, Oliver felt that familiar electric current, the sense of rightness that had been missing from every day since he'd left her standing in the parking lot. Oliver, Janet said quietly, I need you to understand something. Okay. I'm not going to be your project. I'm not going to be the woman who makes you feel better about your success or helps you reconnect with your authentic self. I'm just, me. Sometimes inspiring, sometimes frustrated, sometimes struggling with my own stuff. Is that enough? Oliver lifted their joined hands and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Janet Smith, he said softly, you are more than enough. You are everything. And for the first time in 3 weeks, both of them began to believe that maybe, just maybe, love could bridge any gap. Even the one between a tech billionaire and a small-town art teacher who'd learned to see the world with her heart instead of her eyes. The question now wasn't whether they could make it work. The question was how beautiful it would be when they did. Chapter 5. 6 months later, Janet stood in the doorway of what had once been Milbrook's abandoned electronics store, listening to the sounds of construction workers putting the finishing touches on Oliver's new office space. The irony wasn't lost on her. The boy who'd once been too poor to afford proper school supplies was now converting a downtown storefront into a state-of-the-art technology hub for his billion-dollar company. How does it sound? Oliver's voice came from somewhere in the midst of the organized chaos, warm with the satisfaction of someone who'd learned to find joy in building something meaningful rather than just profitable. Like organized chaos, Janet replied, stepping carefully into the space with her white cane. But good chaos. Productive chaos. That's exactly what I was going for. Oliver appeared beside her, his hand finding her elbow with the natural ease that had developed over months of learning each other's rhythms and needs. 6 months of coffee dates and long conversations, of him learning to describe visual details in ways that painted pictures for her, of her teaching him to experience the world through sound and touch and intuition. 6 months of taking it slowly, of building trust gradually, of proving to each other that what they'd found at the reunion could survive the test of ordinary days and real-life complications. The tech equipment arrives tomorrow, Oliver said, guiding her through the space so she could get a sense of the layout. Desks here, conference room there, and a break area in the back with the coffee machine that James insists is essential for creative thinking. And the art corner? Right where you suggested it should be. North-facing windows for the best natural light, plenty of space for easels and storage, and accessible design throughout. The art corner had been Janet's idea, a space where she could continue teaching her classes, but also where Oliver's employees could learn to think creatively, to problem-solve through hands-on making rather than just digital interfaces. It was a perfect synthesis of their two worlds, a way for Janet's gift for helping people see differently to complement Oliver's talent for innovative thinking. "This is really happening," Janet said, wonder clear in her voice. "Having second thoughts?" "No. Just, amazed thoughts. 6 months ago, I never could have imagined this." "Which part? The office space or us?" "Both. All of it." Oliver stopped walking, and Janet felt him turn toward her. Even after all these months, she could still feel the intensity of his attention like warmth on her skin. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly. "About us?" "Never." Janet reached out, her fingers finding his face with practiced ease. "About you turning your life upside down to move back here? Sometimes I worry that you'll wake up one day and realize what you gave up." "Janet." Oliver's hands covered hers, pressing her palms more firmly against his cheeks. "Look at me. Really look." It was a phrase that had become their shorthand for the moments when words weren't enough, when Janet needed to read his sincerity through touch rather than sound. "I didn't give anything up," Oliver said, his voice steady and certain. "I gained everything. A life that actually means something. Work that feeds my soul instead of just my bank account. A community that knows me as a person instead of a net worth. And you. God, Janet, especially you. Even when I have bad days. When I'm frustrated with my limitations or exhausted from navigating a world that wasn't designed for me. Especially then. Because on your worst days, you're still the strongest person I know. And because loving someone means showing up for all of it, not just the easy parts." Janet felt tears prick at her eyes. 6 months of this man proving, day after day, that his love wasn't conditional on her being inspirational or grateful or anything other than herself had slowly dismantled every wall she'd built around her heart. "I love you," she said, the words still feeling precious and slightly miraculous every time she said them. "I love you too. More than I ever thought it was possible to love someone." They stood in the middle of Oliver's new office, surrounded by the sounds of their combined future taking shape, and Janet felt something settle in her chest that she'd never expected to feel again, the deep security of being known completely and loved anyway. "Oliver," she said quietly. Ask me again." "Ask you what again?" "The question you asked me 3 months ago. The one I said I wasn't ready to answer." Oliver's hands stilled against hers. 3 months ago, during a walk along the lake where they'd both played as children, Oliver had asked Janet to marry him. Not with a ring or a dramatic proposal, but with the quiet honesty that had become their hallmark. "Someday," he'd said, "when you're ready, I'd like to marry you. Not because I need to possess you or complete you, but because I can't imagine building a life with anyone else." Janet had told him then that she needed time, needed to be sure that what they had could survive the transition from reunion romance to everyday reality. She'd needed to know that he truly understood what he was signing up for, that his love wasn't built on a fantasy of saving or fixing her. Now, 6 months of ordinary mornings and difficult conversations and small daily kindnesses later, she had her answer. "Janet Smith," Oliver said, his voice rough with emotion, "will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life proving that love doesn't have to be practical to be real? Will you teach me to see the world the way you do, and let me show you all the ways you've changed mine?" "Yes," Janet said, the word coming out as half laugh, half sob. "Yes, yes, obviously yes." Oliver lifted her off her feet, spinning her around in the middle of the construction zone while she laughed and held on tight. When he set her down, his forehead rested against hers, and Janet could feel his smile as clearly as if she could see it. "I don't have a ring yet," Oliver said. "I wanted to make sure you said yes before I started shopping for something you'd have to wear forever." "I don't need a ring to know this is real," Janet replied. But when you do shop for one, remember that I'll experience it through touch, not sight. I want something with texture, with character. Something that feels as interesting as it looks. I'll remember that. Along with everything else you've taught me about experiencing the world differently. Have you ever had someone love you exactly as you are, without trying to fix or change you? That kind of acceptance, where someone sees all your struggles and chooses you anyway, can transform everything. Share your stories of unconditional love in the comments below. These connections remind us that we're worthy of love just as we are. As they stood in the embrace of their shared future, Janet heard familiar footsteps approaching. Helen's practical shoes on the unfinished floor, moving with the determined pace of someone on a mission. Janet Marie Smith, Helen called out before she was even fully in the room, "Please tell me you finally said yes to this man's proposal, because I've already started planning your engagement party." "Helen, were you eavesdropping?" Janet asked, though she was laughing. "I was not eavesdropping. I was checking on the progress of my future brother-in-law's office renovation. The fact that I arrived during a romantic moment is just good timing." Oliver extended his hand toward Helen, and Janet could hear the smile in his voice. "Hello, Helen. I hope you approve of your new brother-in-law." "Oh, I approved months ago," Helen said, and Janet could hear her emotion despite her practical tone. "When you moved your entire life back here just to see if you and Janet could build something real together. That's when I knew you were serious about her." "I've never been more serious about anything in my life." "Good. Because she deserves someone who's sure. She deserves someone who sees what an incredible woman she is and doesn't take that for granted." "I see it," Oliver said quietly. "Every day, I see it." Over the next few hours, word of their engagement spread through Milbrook with the speed that only small-town news could achieve. Mrs. Henderson called to offer her congratulations and insist on helping with wedding planning. Sophia arrived with champagne and tears of joy. Hazel, now 17 and even more direct than she'd been at the reunion, demanded to know if she could be the maid of honor and whether the wedding would be Instagram-worthy. By evening, Janet and Oliver found themselves back at the community center, the same space where they'd met, surrounded by friends and family who'd gathered for an impromptu engagement celebration. The irony of returning to the scene of their first meeting wasn't lost on either of them. "Remember when you asked me to be your three-legged race partner?" Janet said as they sat together at a table laden with congratulations casseroles and homemade desserts. "Best decision I ever made," Oliver replied. "Though I should probably confess something." "What?" "I had no idea what I was doing. I just knew I wanted to be near you." "I knew," Janet said with a grin. "Your technique was terrible. But your intentions were good." "My technique has improved." "Has it? We should test that theory." Oliver laughed. "Are you challenging me to another three-legged race?" "I'm challenging you to a lifetime of figuring things out together. Think you're up for it? With you as my partner? I can't wait." As the celebration continued around them, Janet found herself thinking about the journey that had brought them here. A year ago, she'd been reluctant to attend the family reunion, certain that she'd spend the day being treated like a tragic figure or an inspirational example. She'd never imagined that she'd meet someone who would see her as simply herself, not broken, not particularly brave, just human and worthy of love. "What are you thinking about?" Oliver asked, clearly reading something in her expression. "Just, how different everything is now. How different I am." "How so?" "A year ago, I was so focused on proving that I could manage everything alone, that I didn't need help from anyone. I thought independence meant never being vulnerable, never needing someone else. And now? Now I know that real independence means having the confidence to be vulnerable with the right person. It means knowing that you're complete on your own, but choosing to share that completeness with someone who values it." Oliver's hand found hers across the table, their fingers intertwining with the natural ease that had developed over months of small intimacies and daily kindnesses. "You taught me something similar," Oliver said. "I spent so many years thinking that success meant never needing anyone, that strength meant solving every problem alone. You showed me that the strongest thing you can do is trust someone else to be your partner." "We make a good team," Janet said, echoing the words Oliver had spoken after their scavenger hunt victory. "The best team." As the evening wound down and friends and family began heading home, Janet and Oliver found themselves walking slowly around the community center, retracing the steps of their first afternoon together. "The Memorial Garden," Janet said as they approached the quiet space behind the building. "Want to sit for a few minutes?" They settled on the stone bench that Janet had designed, the bench that had served as their "something that represents hope" during the scavenger hunt. The inscription, "In memory of those who taught us that love is the only thing that grows when shared," seemed even more meaningful now. "I want to tell you something," Janet said as they sat in comfortable silence. "What's that?" "When I designed this garden, when I carved those words into this bench, I was trying to convince myself that I believed them. I was hoping that if I created something beautiful about love and connection, maybe someday I'd experience it myself. And now? Now I know they're true. Love really is the only thing that grows when shared. What we have together is bigger and better than anything either of us could create alone." Oliver lifted Janet's hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles in the gesture that had become one of their most cherished intimacies. "Janet," he said quietly, "I need you to know something too. Tell me. That day at the reunion, when I asked you to be my three-legged race partner, I thought I was just asking for help with a game. I had no idea I was actually asking you to be my partner in life. And if you had known? I would have asked anyway. Maybe sooner." Janet turned toward him, her hand finding his face in the gesture that always preceded their most important conversations. "Oliver Burns," she said softly, "are you ready to be my partner for life? Through three-legged races and scavenger hunts and ordinary Tuesday mornings and difficult conversations and everything else that comes with building a real life together?" "Janet Smith," Oliver replied, his voice steady and sure, "I've been ready since the moment you trusted me to catch that falling cup of punch." When they kissed, there in the garden that Janet had created as a testament to hope, it was with the deep certainty of two people who had found their perfect match. Not because they completed each other, but because they enhanced each other. Not because they needed fixing, but because they chose love. As they walked back toward Oliver's car, ready to begin the next chapter of their story, Janet realized that the inscription on her memorial bench had been prophetic in ways she'd never imagined. Love truly was the only thing that grew when shared, and what she and Oliver had built together was proof that sometimes the most beautiful connections happen when you least expect them, in places you never thought to look, with people who see your heart rather than your circumstances. 6 months earlier, Janet had been afraid to hope for something that seemed impossible. Now, with Oliver's hand in hers and a lifetime of shared adventures ahead of them, she understood that the most impossible things were often the most worth fighting for. The girl who'd been forgotten at the family reunion had found someone who would never forget her worth. The billionaire who'd lost himself in success had found someone who helped him remember who he really was. And together, they discovered that love really could bridge any gap, even the one between two hearts that had given up on finding their perfect match. In the end, the most beautiful part wasn't that they'd found each other. It was that they'd chosen each other, every day, in all the small moments that make up a life truly lived. That was the kind of love worth sharing. That was the kind of story worth telling. And that was only the beginning. Chapter 6. 1 year later, the Milbrook Community Center buzzed with the same energy it had held during that fateful Smith family reunion, but now it was decorated with white flowers and soft lighting for a very different kind of celebration. Janet and Oliver's wedding day had arrived, and the entire town had gathered to witness the union of two people who had proven that love could indeed bridge any gap. Janet stood in the small room behind the community center's main hall, her wedding dress chosen not for how it looked but for how it felt, silk that whispered against her skin, intricate beadwork that created texture under her fingertips, and a design that allowed her to move with confidence and grace. Sophia was putting the finishing touches on her hair while Helen fussed with the dress's train, both women working with the careful attention of people who understood that this day was about so much more than ceremony. "You ready for this?" Sophia asked, stepping back to admire her handiwork. "I've been ready since the day he asked me to be his three-legged race partner," Janet replied, and the truth of that statement surprised her with its clarity. Through the thin walls, she could hear the gentle murmur of guests taking their seats, the soft music that Oliver had chosen specifically for its acoustic properties, and the occasional laugh from someone sharing a memory or greeting an old friend. It was exactly the kind of wedding Janet had always imagined she'd want: intimate, meaningful, surrounded by people who truly knew and loved them. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," Helen called. "It's me," Oliver's voice came through the door. "I know it's bad luck to see the bride before the ceremony, but I was hoping I could talk to her for just a minute." "Oliver Burns, you are not seeing my sister in her wedding dress before you walk down that aisle," Helen declared with mock sternness. "I'll close my eyes," Oliver promised. "I just want to give her something." Janet laughed, charmed by his persistence. "Let him in, Helen. But no peeking." The door opened, and Oliver stepped inside, his eyes squeezed comically shut. Even without being able to see his expression, Janet could feel his presence fill the room with warmth and barely contain joy. "This is ridiculous," Sophia said with affection. "You two are ridiculous." "Ridiculously perfect for each other," Helen added, and Janet could hear the emotion in her sister's voice. "Janet," Oliver said, his eyes still closed, "I have something for you. Wedding gift, but also... well, you'll understand when you feel it." He extended his hand toward her, and Janet reached out to accept whatever he was offering. Her fingers closed around a small object, clearly a ring, but not the engagement ring she was already wearing. This one had weight and texture, intricate details that spoke of careful craftsmanship and thoughtful design. "What is this?" she asked, exploring the ring with her fingertips. "Your wedding band. But it's also... I had it made specially." The design is a three-dimensional map of the community center's layout. The band represents the main room where we met, and there are tiny raised sections for the playground where we did the scavenger hunt, the memorial garden where we had our first real conversation, and the spot where we fell during the three-legged race. Janet felt tears spring to her eyes as her fingers traced the miniature landscape of their love story, transformed into something she could carry with her always. "Oliver," she whispered, "it's perfect. There's more. If you trace along the band, following the path from where we met to where we got engaged, the metal is actually engraved with Braille." Janet's fingers found the tiny dots, reading the message with growing wonder: "Every step led me to you." "You can open your eyes now," she said softly, no longer caring about wedding superstitions. When Oliver looked at her, his expression was everything Janet had hoped to inspire in someone. Not awe at her courage or pity for her struggles, but pure, uncomplicated love for exactly who she was. "You're beautiful," he said simply. "Inside and out, yesterday and today and always, you're the most beautiful person I've ever known." "So are you," Janet replied, meaning it completely. They stood there for a moment, surrounded by the people who loved them most, sharing the quiet intimacy that had become their signature. Then the music changed, signaling that it was time for the ceremony to begin. "Ready to make this official?" Oliver asked. "I've been ready since you caught that cup of punch," Janet replied. The ceremony itself was everything they'd hoped it would be: personal vows that spoke of partnership and growth, rings exchanged with hands that trembled slightly with joy, and a kiss that sealed not just their marriage but their promise to keep choosing each other through whatever life might bring. But it was the reception that truly captured the spirit of their love story. Instead of traditional wedding activities, Janet and Oliver had organized games and interactive experiences that brought out the playful connection that had started their relationship. There was, of course, a three-legged race, this time with Oliver and Janet as the reigning champions. There was a scavenger hunt with clues that celebrated their journey together. And there was dancing, with Oliver describing the movement of the other couple so Janet could feel part of the visual celebration while they swayed together to music chosen for its meaning rather than its trendiness. As the evening wound down, Janet and Oliver found themselves back in the memorial garden, stealing a few quiet moments away from the celebration. They sat on the bench where they'd shared so many important conversations, now as husband and wife, surrounded by the scent of late summer flowers and the soft sounds of their wedding reception continuing inside. "Any regrets?" Oliver asked, echoing the question he'd posed so many times throughout their relationship. "Only that it took us 34 years to find each other," Janet replied. "What about you?" "I regret every day I spent building a life that didn't include you. But I don't regret the journey that led me back here, because it made me someone worthy of your love." "Oliver Burns," Janet said, turning to face him fully, "you were always worthy of love. You just needed to remember it. You reminded me. You remind me every day." They sat in comfortable silence, processing the magnitude of the day and the journey that had brought them here. A year and a half ago, they'd been strangers whose lives intersected for a single afternoon. Now they were partners, building something together that was bigger and more beautiful than anything either could have created alone. "I love our story," Janet said quietly. "I love that it started with falling down and getting back up together. I love that you saw me before you knew my story, and that I felt your heart before I knew your history. I love that you taught me what it means to really see someone," Oliver replied. "I love that you showed me how to trust without needing to control outcomes. I love that we found each other at a place where neither of us expected to find anything meaningful. Most of all," Oliver said, "I love that this is just the beginning." As if summoned by their words, they heard familiar voices approaching through the garden. Helen and Sophia, Hazel and Mrs. Henderson, and a handful of other friends and family members who had noticed their absence and come looking for them. "There you are," Hazel called out. "You can't disappear from your own wedding reception." "We were just taking a moment," Janet laughed, standing up and reaching for Oliver's hand. "Well, take your moment inside," Helen insisted. "Mrs. Patterson wants to give a toast, and she's been practicing her speech all week." As they walked back toward the community center, surrounded by the people who had supported their love story from the beginning, Janet felt overwhelmed by gratitude. Not just for Oliver, though he was the center of everything, but for the journey that had brought her here. For the accident that had taught her to see differently. For the family reunion she hadn't wanted to attend. For the courage to trust someone with her heart despite all the reasons to protect it. "Ready to go back to the party, Mrs. Burns?" Oliver asked as they approached the door. "Ready, Mr. Burns," Janet replied, loving the sound of their new shared name. And as they rejoined their celebration, hand in hand and heart to heart, they carried with them the profound knowledge that they had found something rare and precious, a love that enhanced rather than completed, that celebrated rather than fixed, that grew stronger not in spite of their individual journeys but because of them. The woman who had been forgotten at a family reunion had found someone who would never forget her worth. The man who had lost himself in success had found someone who helped him remember who he really was. And together, they had built a love story that proved the most impossible dreams were often the most worth pursuing. Now, dear hearts, I want to hear from you. Have you ever had someone see your true worth when you couldn't see it yourself? Have you experienced a moment when someone chose you not despite your challenges, but simply because they loved who you are? Share your stories of unexpected love and chosen family in the comments below. Your experiences inspire these tales, and every heart that has found its home gives hope to those still searching. If this story touched your soul, please hit that like button and subscribe for tomorrow's journey into another heart that discovered love in the most unexpected places. Tomorrow, We'll explore what happens when a woman inherits her grandmother's mysterious bookshop and discovers that some love stories are written in the margins of forgotten books. Remember, beautiful souls, you are worthy of love exactly as you are. Your struggles don't make you broken, your differences don't make you less than, and your journey, whatever it looks like, is leading you exactly where you need to go. Sometimes the most beautiful connections happen when we least expect them, with people who see our hearts rather than our circumstances. Until tomorrow, keep believing in the magic of unexpected love, and never forget that your story is still being written. The best chapters might just be around the corner. And in the warm glow of the community center, as Janet and Oliver Burns danced their first dance as husband and wife, their love story became part of the fabric of Milbrook's history. A reminder that some connections transcend logic, that some people are worth rearranging your entire life for, and that sometimes the most perfect partner is the one who helps you become the person you were always meant to be. Their three-legged race had become a lifetime partnership, their scavenger hunt had led them home to each other, and their love had proven that the most beautiful views come not from what you can see, but from finally understanding that you are worthy of being truly seen. In the end, that was the only thing that mattered. That was the only thing that would ever matter. Love, in all its imperfect, impossible, beautiful glory. Love that grows when shared. Love that bridges every gap. Love that changes everything.